Okay, so let's make something perfectly clear. Ben Askren's UFC run was a massive failure, yet you'd be convinced otherwise by the countless postmortems conducted on his career by the MMA media. And it's not everyone, and it might not even be the majority, but I've found that many are either confusing success with impact or else outright substituting it. Impact never constitutes success unless a fighter's ultimate goal is to make an impression, but that doesn't work with Ben Askren, and he'd be the first to admit that. Back when he retired in 2017, he insisted that the only thing that could lure him back was the chance to prove that he's the best in the world.
The one and only one way I would ever come back for another fight is if it was for the number one spot in the world.
And when he got that opportunity through an unprecedented trade between one championship and the UFC, he failed. And while that's irrefutable, he should be praised for how he's handled it afterwards.
I think that the competition is, you're either good enough or you're not, right? And that's kind of one of the things I love so much about it, is there's no gray area. Either you win or you lose, and you have a definite answer. And listen, I've achieved just about everything you can in sport, but when it came to achieving the two biggest things, the Olympic gold medal and then to prove I'm the best fighter in the world, I came up a little bit short.
Yeah, admittedly, MMA in 2019 would be a lot less fun without him. Despite their pandering, the media are accurate in their assertion that he left his mark, but that doesn't mean that we should gloss over everything else. His self-imposed labour was to win, and it'd be disingenuous to overlook that. Either way, I think it's all worth a closer look. In a meritocracy, Askren would have landed in the UFC years ago. In 2013, undefeated at 11-0, he was the reigning Bellator welterweight champion, but his relationship with the organisation soured, so they released him, waiving their right to match any offers to acquire his talents. Logically, the UFC was his next step, but the boss, Dana White, wasn't interested.
Don't want it. No interest.
No interest.
We'll see him in World Series fighting or something
Exactly.
like that.
I'm sure they'll pick him up.
Is there a reason why you have no interest? I mean, have you...
They don't want him.
Well...
It's their champion. They don't want him. What does that say? I mean, what does that mean? I don't even care. Next question. I don't even care about those guys whatsoever.
And while he and Askren did have an on and off again feud over the years, ego was unquestionably instrumental in his decision not to sign him. The mere notion of Bellator's sloppy seconds fighting under his watch was probably enough for him to repudiate the idea. But anyway, long story short, 5 years passed before he put ink to a UFC contract. Askren's first appearance under their banner was a guest spot at UFC 230, and as an onlooker, it was kind of eye-opening. Fans on site not only knew who he was, but when he appeared on screen, they gave him an ovation befitting a top contender. And none of that was a given for a fighter who had operated exclusively outside the UFC bubble. But his decorated past, goodwill from MMA enthusiasts, and his immediate inclusion as a welterweight elite made him a unique case. These days we know him as a marketing virtuoso, but his turn as a media darling is a relatively new development. Before the UFC, hardcore fans lauded his dominance, but for the casual viewer who happened upon his work, an education in smothering was required for them to appreciate his craft. But fanfare or not, the sport's leading authorities consistently ranked him among the best fighters at welterweight. Again, another rare accolade for a fighter outside the UFC. Moreover, he always had the gift of the gab, the quality that made him famous in the UFC, but unfortunately it was often underutilized. Remember, throughout his Bellator run, their format was more akin to a PFL than a UFC. Title opportunities were awarded through tournament victories and not through commercially driven matchmaking. So as a champion, he was compelled to defend against a welterweight tournament winner, regardless of his promotional machinations. And while that's commendable from a sporting perspective, it hamstrings one of his foremost gifts, his wit. One championship was guilty of this too. Their ethos, or at least the one they propagate, is one of honour and respect, and that never served his particular brand of marketing well. But the UFC is a different beast. Their president will call McGregor's bus episode the most disgusting thing in UFC history, yet explicitly use it as a marketing device to generate revenue.
You know, and obviously everybody's shaken up when 30 thugs storm these guys are all cutting weight and getting ready for a fight. This is the most disgusting thing that has ever happened in the history of the company.
These were the conditions that allowed Askren to flourish as the promotion's foremost provocateur. And that's not to say that his trash talk was ever egregious. It was as PG as you could get in a sport like MMA, but he masterfully harnessed the art of self-promotion, public manipulation, and never strayed off brand. He challenged and of course berated virtually every top contender at welterweight, inserting himself into any and all conversations worth having at 170 pounds. And he also rekindled his rivalry with Dana White. He alleged that Dana still despised him, recalling their past exchanges. However, the UFC president insisted otherwise. Nevertheless, it was an ingenious play by Askren, whether you believed it was genuine or not. Dana, though not a fighter, is the public face of the business, and he's also one of the sport's biggest stars, so being closely associated with him kept Askren's name firmly in the public consciousness. Furthermore, the omnipotent boss versus lowly subordinate narrative has always made for good television, be it in MMA or pro wrestling. See Dana White versus Tito Ortiz or Vince McMahon versus Stone Cold Steve Austin. So Askren, in a way, was playing self-promotional chess, and he was 5 moves ahead of the audience. But for checkmate, he had to win fights, and that wasn't going to be easy. For his debut, he was tasked with perhaps the most accurately nicknamed fighter in MMA, Ruthless Robbie Lawler.
Because if I hurt him, I wasn't taking his neck.
What were you going to take?
His soul.
And on paper, it was a nightmare matchup for him. Lawler had just spent the last few years defending takedowns so he could wreck people, which is the exact thing Askren was trying to avoid. But in the end, Askren prevailed, but only by the skin of his teeth. He survived a round of hell before the referee determined that his bulldog choke had put Lawler to sleep. And while it was a controversial ruling, that didn't deter him. Tongue placed firmly in cheek, he asked Dana if that was the best that he's got, staying right on brand. And then he declared that he'd face the winner of Darren Till versus Jorge Masvidal, but it was clear that he favoured the Liverpoolian, which isn't all that surprising. He was on the heels of a title challenge, while Gamebred, who was on a 2-fight losing streak, hadn't fought in over a year. Furthermore, Till was willing to engage his perpetual wisecracking, whereas Masvidal wasn't. So in theory, that was an easier sell. But then Masvidal reincarnated as the sport's premier anti-trash talk crusader, and the paradigm shifted. He knocked out Till, closed Leon Edwards' mouth with a 3-piece, and now a showdown with Askren, his antithesis, made all the sense in the world. He's always detested trash talk, but now its rejection was his central policy. And the matchup, which eventually was booked for UFC 239, represented a juxtaposition of everything. Personality, philosophy, fight style, you name it. And Askren, as advertised, continuously provoked a stoic Masvidal leading into the contest, but ultimately it was all for naught. Gamebred made UFC history at his expense, sleeping him with a flying knee just 5 seconds into their contest, and a star was born. But this clash felt very different from most. Generally, MMA isn't a zero-sum game in the popularity transfer sense. Ultimately, you're left with a winner and a loser, sure, but ordinarily, said winner doesn't siphon all of their opponent's shine. But in this instance, you could argue to the contrary because of Askren's bold promotional strategy, which invites grave consequences in the event of defeat. And there are endless takes on his role in Masvidal's ascendancy, but many of them are coloured with prejudice. And while we all have our unconscious biases, myself included, here's how I see it. Their contest presented him with a breakout role, and Askren played a pivotal co-lead in it. The flying knee was the climax of the story, but without that, the story, it'd be less. Not insignificant because history never is, but less. However, despite his influence, I can't say that Masvidal should thank Askren. That's a reductive assertion because Askren never intended for Masvidal to succeed. We should be honest in recognising that Askren was the catalyst to Masvidal's breakthrough, but all credit should go to the winner for capitalising. Askren's last hurrah against Damian Maia forced him to strip things back. The wisecracking was gone, revealing only the competitor. And I think there were a few factors at play here. Maia is universally respected and consequently he's practically impervious to ridicule. But above all else, this fight felt like a personal challenge for Askren. Remember, despite the plaudits he gets for his verbal craft and the abuses he takes for his physique, he is a world-class athlete. He competed at the Olympics, and you don't reach such heights, especially in a sport like wrestling, without being a great athlete and a fierce competitor. So after a blemish sullied his MMA resume and he suffered perhaps the most embarrassing loss of his athletic career, victory was paramount. But Maia choked him out and put his career to bed. He officially retired in an interview with Ariel Helwani some weeks later, revealing that he needs hip surgery after years of wear and tear. But to his credit, he took absolute ownership of his shortcomings despite ample opportunity to shift blame elsewhere.
I don't want people to think that I'm using this as a reason why I lost. I lost because I wasn't good enough. Plain and simple. My opponents beat me. They were better than me. And I want that to be just said out there.
And I do understand why a lot of people, especially the media, shifted their focus away from the results to everything else he offered. If MMA isn't oversaturated already, then we're dangerously teetering on that precipice. And while that offers perks, notably more fights, it also produces inherent negatives like more uninteresting fights. So you can see how spinning a triumphant yarn about his UFC stint could be appealing. You can say a lot of things about it, but claiming it was uninteresting isn't one of them. However, awarding a participation medal of sorts does a disservice to an athlete of his caliber. He set an explicit goal when he signed in November of 2018 to prove he was the best welterweight in the world. And 12 months later, well, you know the rest. Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, you can subscribe to the channel by hitting the button on screen, and also slap that bell and hit that like button because it helps us out quite a lot. And I understand that this is kind of old news, but I hope you enjoyed it, and for these video essay type videos, I like to give them some thought and actually get my thoughts out there instead of just, reacting to them in the minute.